Welcome back, everybody, to the next episode of Lessons from Terrible Students. As always, we are the Terrible Students. My name is Jeremy. That's Sarah. Sarah, say hello.
Hey, everybody.
As with most of our other episodes this season, we do have a guest speaker, and this time we have a returning guest speaker for this episode. We have Ahli Moore back today. We will let him reintroduce himself here shortly for those of you that did not listen to our previous DEI episode. But again, we are bringing back our DEI topic because there are some additional things that have happened since our last episode that we wanted to kind of dive into. So we figured why not bring Ahli back and talk about it some more, because it's a kind of hot topic right now. So we wanted to kind of dive into a different aspect of the DEI topic. But before we get all the way into that, as always, this podcast is brought to you by Lumius. At Lumius, we are your partner in learning. Okay, so like I said at the top, we are going to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion again. So on our previous episode that you were with us with Ahli, we kind of focused on DEI training and kind of what that meant for leadership and employees. We're going to go in a different direction, but first, can you reintroduce yourself to the audience so they kind of know who's talking and all that kind of fun stuff?
Absolutely. So my name is Ali Moore. I am an organizational change practitioner who focuses on leadership development, strategy, DEI, obviously. That's the topic we're talking about today. A number of things that when you think about companies that are going through a transition, and not just companies, like organizations, nonprofits, for-profits, anyone going through a transition, even executives, like as individuals going through a transition, and not the technical side of how to do their business, but some of the things that may be overlooked. How do they interact with each other? How do they support change? How do they support a proactive and purposeful culture within their organization? I focus on all of those things. I do have a background in technology. I do have a background from previous employment in change management. So I kind of fuse and combine those things to go into organizations and listen to what they're struggling with and help them build a strategy to move them into the direction that they want to be in. So that's me. I'm glad to be back with you all to dig more into this topic that's getting so much publicity these days.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic transition. So one of the reasons that we reached back out and wanted to get you back on was because DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, has been kind of back in the news cycle recently, and it's kind of become one of those hot topic, hot button issues. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is kind of why DEI is back in the news cycle and kind of why it's become such a big talking point lately, because it's been around for years and years, for as long as I've been in the workforce, at least. There's been DEI has been a positive focus, I guess I should say. So why is it? I don't want to say it's losing that positive focus, but there's a certain kind of shift in how some people are viewing it I'll be frank, that I don't understand. Yeah. But I just kind of wanted to have a discussion around why it's become kind of a hot topic recently.
I think you see a couple of things happening. First of all, I agree with you that this is not something new, right? DEI, right. The focus on diversity, equity, inclusion has been around for decades, right? And even extending DEI into DEIJ, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, right? All of these things have been around for a while. But I think what happened a few years ago, when it actually picked up a lot of steam around the Black Lives Matters movement, and also in reaction to the George Floyd murder, is that you have a pendulum swinging back and forth, right? And in 2020, there was so much focus placed on these issues and the discussion of these issues that, quite frankly, some of the discussions, depending on the audience, depending on the the situation or the atmosphere where it was being discussed, there were things that are appropriate to be discussed at certain levels. Right? If you are speaking to elementary school students, that is different than if you're speaking to high school age students. The
Mm.
curriculum is different than if you're speaking with college students. And the focus of studying those things is different than when you are focused on a corporate setting. And so, as you discuss these topics, there were some I've reviewed lots of different curricula. I've observed different training and practice, and some of them absolutely hit the mark and discussed what needed to be discussed. Some of the others maybe went too far in the examples that they were using for certain audiences. And when people saw that, they took the opportunity to bounce on it, right? To just pounce on this in a way that was also inappropriately swinging the pendulum too far in the other direction. And so,
Mm.
what do I mean by that? You have, and I'll talk about that in the context of when I said there were a couple of things happening. One, the education around DEI, but then how it became politicized. And
Right.
regardless of where, so we're not here to talk politics, but regardless of where you stand in terms of your level of liberalism or conservatism, or wherever you stand in that spectrum, right? All politicians use things, leverage things to their advantage so that they can get votes. And if you can demonize something, anything, you can, rally the troops around that to vote
Mm.
for you. And DEI is a perfect example. And so when people saw things like teaching at a level that maybe some of the audience got, maybe some of the audience didn't get, they used that as an example of saying, look, DEI is trying to indoctrinate people to think a certain way. DEI is trying to indoctrinate people to give unfair advantages to certain groups of people and alienate other groups of people, when in fact, the entire premise of diversity, equity, and inclusion is to eliminate any type of bias and make sure there's a level playing field, not bring anyone down, not boost anyone up, but just say, are we taking a look at all eligible candidates for jobs? Are we taking a look at all eligible candidates to be recruited by our company? Are we taking a look at any barriers that historically have been put in the way of people finding the same level of success? Are we removing those so that everyone can have a level playing field? But that's not the way that people have redefined DEI. They've taken this concept, stolen it, like flipped it into something that it's not, and now they're using it as this monolithic buzzword to represent something that it isn't. At the end of the day, if you look at the three words, right, if you take off the other letters, the J, the B, et cetera, and you just look at DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it means, are we encouraging diversity of thought, diversity of people? Are we embracing what each individual brings, even if they don't share our same background, if they don't share our same political beliefs, if they don't share our same socioeconomic, status? If none of those things matter for their ability to do the job, or none of those things matter for their ability to be recruited by our company or recruited by our school, then are we ensuring that those things are not impacting our ability to find the best people? Right. The same thing with equity and equitable treatment. Is everybody in our company, does everyone in our company receive the same attention? Do they receive the same opportunities for success? Or are there inherent barriers that may have been relics of policies of the past or unwritten rules of the past that are holding women back, holding people where English is a second language? If you're in a position where your ability to speak with an English or an Americanized accent doesn't matter, then are we still holding that against people, right? And
Mm.
then obviously inclusion, your sense of belonging. Who doesn't want an environment where everyone feels that they belong there? And so when I look at the definition of those, it's to me it's silly to conflate what DEI is with something negative. But like I said at the beginning, I'm a realist. I did see where some training may have been inappropriate for certain levels. However, even with that, people were misconstruing what was training versus what was, in education. And a perfect example is um, critical race theory, right?
Yep.
Which you cannot separate from this discussion at this point. Well, critical race theory is a university level discussion,
Right.
which discusses, just like any other theory, here are certain lenses that you can use to look at the world, right? And critical race theory simply says that in this country, you cannot view history, you cannot talk about success, you can't separate the impact that race has had on this country from other discussions. That's what critical race theory in its essence says. Now, that was not being taught at the elementary school or high
Right. It
school
was
level.
college level, and not
It's
even like
it's
not even like 100 level college
yeah,
courses.
it's an advanced college level
Yeah.
discussion, and it's a discussion just like any other theory, where an instructor will say, "Here's a theory for us to review, discuss, debate, poke holes through, look at the pros and cons, and then you can use it for whatever you want to use it for." So when opponents to DEI started saying, "Oh, we're indoctrinating our children with critical race theory," that couldn't be farther from the truth. Now, I'm sorry, I'm taking up all of our time, but I
No,
will
you're
say
fine.
this:
Well,
each
you
of these, yeah, each of these incidents and each of these sort of scenarios and things that we'll talk about, that I have talked about, and that we'll continue to talk about. Some of them have trends. Some of them are very specific. So when we talk about DEI for a particular client or a particular company or an organization, there are things that are unique to that organization that aren't shared by other organizations. And so you can't look at the entire thing and say this is good or this is bad. You have to look at, how does this serve a purpose for our organization, and is it necessary within our organization? 9 times out of 10, it's absolutely necessary. To the
Mhm.
degree that you focus on it and how you define it, that's unique to your specific situation.
Yeah. No, and I could have an entire episode on critical race theory and the absolute misunderstanding of why everybody was so mad at that. When that came out, I didn't understand why everybody was so mad at it. First of all, I'm like, this is not in elementary school people. Like, this is something that I would have taken as like a junior or senior in college. But and outside of that, it's something that I probably would have enjoyed taking, because it would have given me a different perspective, which I think that's what they had an issue with,
Yeah.
because there was nothing in, as I read through it, because I call this my personal flaw, because when I see something like this, I end up digging into it way more than I should have, I guess, because I want to figure out what it's all about. But when you dig into it, it's like, well, none of this is wrong. Like
Mhm.
it's factually backed up. Like, this is what happened. Um, and I think
And
that's where a lot of their problems with it, because they couldn't debate the factual basis of a lot of what it was
people
based on.
people
But
don't like to feel shame.
yeah,
You
and
know,
yeah,
it makes them uncomfortable.
exactly. And I think both of you bring up a great point as it relates to facts. Facts are facts. History
Right.
is history. And I can't control how someone else feels about it, especially if it's true, right? And I
right,
shouldn't have to worry about how someone else feels about it. But in order for us to understand why race relations are the way that they are now, in order for us to understand why certain parts of town exist in
yeah,
a depressed state, and all, you have to understand the history of these things. And so
exactly,
that's the part where I think opponents of DEI took advantage of how people were coming out of certain classes and workshops feeling about themselves and saying, this entire discussion was designed to make someone hate our country or to make someone feel bad, when in fact it wasn't. If you don't understand the actual history, you need to understand the history, good or bad, and then we can have the further discussions of, what do we do to make sure that doesn't happen again? What do we
right,
do to make sure that, whether you believe in reparations or not, right? Big R reparations, which is money, small R reparations, what are things that you can do to
mhm,
right the ship and balance the playing field, right? We're not telling people you have to feel bad for what someone else may have done. But you do need to understand how certain people may have benefited while
Mhm.
other people were depressed and oppressed by those actions, so that you can have a better understanding of how our country came together.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that also lays the foundation of like the unconscious bias discussion. It lays the foundation of why some of these DEI foundations are important in interviewing and in retaining talent and all that kind of stuff, because you have to understand your own biases and what you bring to the table, both positive and negative, in that, talent discussion, to understand why these DEI functions are important. Because
Yeah.
as much as everybody thinks that they're, you know, not bothered by bias and that they're all fair minded and all that, we're all people, and nobody is 100% without bias. Like everybody is biased about something. That's just how we as people are made. And that's why, in my completely unprofessional opinion, that's why these DEI programs are important, right? That's and please correct me if I'm wrong, but that's why they were, or one of the reasons why they were created to begin with, is to start to address some of the biases in kind of the hiring practices and in the college admission practices.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about bias, you know, so I teach a couple of different versions of an unconscious bias workshop, and we move away from race, although that's the one of the biggest ones that we see. There's gender-based bias, there's sexual orientation-based bias, right? And what I ask people to do is think about times when you may have experienced this, but also think about times where you witnessed it, right? You weren't a part of the conversation, but you witnessed someone who was absolutely showing bias against someone else. But then also think about a time where you may have been guilty of it, and it's not so much you should feel bad, although depending on what it is, maybe you should feel bad.
Right.
But it's you may have been the perpetrator of some of these things and not even known it. And so I show a bunch of biases that are not even connected to race, so that we can move away from that as the primary part of the discussion and show there are affinity and similarity biases that people have, where there's nothing wrong with me wanting to be around people that I like, that we share the same interests, that we may have the same background. There's nothing wrong with that at all. It becomes an issue when I start to make decisions in the workplace based on that affinity or similarity bias, when all of a sudden the only people that I am promoting are the people who look like me, act like me, share my same similarities. Maybe I'm more connected to them because we share similar interests outside of work, but that should not creep into my decision. If I'm building an organization that's based on meritocracy, that shouldn't impact my decisions when it comes to their ability to effectively do the job. So if someone doesn't share my similarities, doesn't share my same interests, are they are they at a disadvantage, right? That's what affinity and similarity bias is all about. But there's so many different types of biases. Um, a couple. I was going to say a couple of the fun ones that I talk about, but they're not fun at all. But there are things like that people don't even consider. The halo effect and the horns effect are a couple. The halo effect is I find out something good about you. Let's say pick the US's number one uh, college or university, right? Harvard, Yale, pick one of those schools, and you graduated from that school. And just as the name would imply, a halo effect, I put a halo around your head or on top of your head because you graduated from Harvard. And maybe that's what got you in the door. Maybe you were the absolute best candidate. But the halo effect is now, because I put that halo on your head, because you came from, the top school in the nation, there's almost nothing else that you can do wrong. Anything that you do, I make a reason why I can diminish anything that you do wrong because I've put you up on this pedestal. And the opposite of that is the horns effect. That, let's say, you are a qualified candidate, you were recruited by our company, you were hired by our company. Maybe you came from your route here, in just using this education analogy. Maybe Maybe you didn't go to college right away. Maybe you went to a technical trade school and then you went and got an AA degree and then you went to a 4-year public university, but you are just as qualified as that Yale graduate, as that Harvard graduate. But because of the way that you got to your level of education isn't the what we would consider the traditional way or the same. Now anything that you do, I attribute that to, well, their educational background isn't as strong or isn't as good, not taking into account whether you can actually do the job or not, but using that as a reason to ding you on anything. And that's a type of bias. And so we talk through all of those, ageism, gender bias, like I said earlier, name bias, beauty bias, which actually goes both ways. Beauty bias is an interesting one because they're first of all, what is beauty, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and what one culture, what one country, what one part of the world considers to be beautiful, another, and I'm talking aesthetics, right? People's actual looks is completely different depending on where you travel. Even within our own country, depending on what side of the country you're in, or if you're in north, south, beauty is all very subjective. But the beauty bias comes in where in our country we've been taught that good looking people are successful, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because we believe they're successful, we give them more opportunities to be successful, and we give them better opportunities, and then by magic they fulfill that because we've given them those opportunities. But the flip side of that, and someone in one of the workshops actually pointed this out to me, they said, yeah, beauty bias can also be a detriment where people just assume that someone was able to get into their position because of their looks, and then they start to hold that against them. So any of these things are different types of biases. And when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we are trying to move people away from any of these, not just race, not just gender, not just sexual orientation, but anything that you would assume about someone, a stereotype, right? Maybe it was something that was born out of your own upbringing, and then you formed this unconscious bias around it. You turned it into a stereotype about those types of people, and that became true for you. And now it's converted into microaggressions and micro inequities in your workplace. The focus of DEI is to try to combat all of that.
Yeah, and it's, I don't know, for me it always seems like it's the old adage, right, of like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Like it seems like we recognize this, and we get years of where we're instituting these DEI policies, and then they start to work, and then all of a sudden there's this huge uproar around, we're picking this as the boogeyman for this election cycle. So now we're going to start, taking these things back out. Yep. And we're going to take our 2 steps back, right? Like for example, I live in North Carolina. So the school system in North Carolina is starting to dismantle DEI programs. And there's, they have reasons for that. And to try to avoid the political discussion, we won't go into that, but they are what seems to be from the outside politically motivated reasons for that.
Yep.
But I don't understand, because from what you're talking about, it's more than just what they're making it out to be. Like there's a reason that these programs are here. So, and from what I'm researching and from what I'm looking at, the majority of people working in the workforce believe and know that having these DEI programs in place are a good thing. Yeah. Specifically from what you've been talking about, because it's not just, for minorities or for specific folks. It's for everybody. Like when these things are in place, it benefits everybody at the company, because it means that the best person is getting the role. So if you are the best qualified candidate, you will get the role, and you're judged by what you're able to bring to the role as a person rather than anything else.
As a skilled person, right? Exactly. I had a recent conversation with the chief HR officer of, I won't say the name of it, but a large institution that's been impacted by this. Mm. And what this person told me was that, listen, I'm doing the job of an HR officer. No one is released or fired from this company without me reviewing the reason why. And so whether you want to call it DEI or not, I review all of these to ensure that if they're leaving or they were fired or they were terminated, it wasn't for a reason that was outside of their control. It wasn't for a reason that would show some sort of favoritism or bias against them or favoritism for some other type of person. And so this person told me, look, let's strike the word DEI. I'm doing the work of an HR officer, and that is to ensure that our best people are retained. When people are not retained, it is for a tangible reason, and it can't be attributed to some type of bias. So, I'm very familiar with the situation that you were talking about with the institutions of higher education. It's happening in the state of Florida. It's happening in Alabama. It's happening in Texas, North Carolina, a number of places across the country. And so it made a big splash because different governors, different legislators said, we're going to do away with these programs. And they kind of held these universities hostage because what they said was, and they passed this at the ballot box. So if people are and were upset about it, you have to make your perspective known at the ballot box. But what they did was they passed legislation that said, do what you want, but we will defund, our funding for universities that have DEI programs or have a DEI office. And so, in the one, swipe of a pen on a piece of paper, it became legal in certain states. And when people got upset about it, said, so you're going to do away with this, then I'm no longer going to support this school. Well, these schools stand to lose hundreds of millions of dollars because these are the majority of these are public institutions.
Right.
And if you're a private institution, you're a private company, you don't have to necessarily adhere to that legislation. But if you are funded by a state and that state says we are going to withhold your funding and it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars, it doesn't, I won't say it doesn't matter, but it is a hard sell for me as an alumnus of a university to say, well, then I'm going to hold back my scholarship. And the school will probably say, okay, well, hold back your $50,000. I'm not going to lose my $150 million, right? And so it's a tough situation. It's a really tough situation. But I think going back to, one of the comments that I made earlier, and I know there are probably people that are going to listen to this and try to pick it apart and say, okay, here's where he's off base on this. But when you have people who are running for office, and this has nothing to do with actual, ethics and things like that, it's merely a play for votes. Then, as you said, they're going to each election cycle just follow the history of issues in this country. There will be some issue that is chosen to be the boogeyman, the one that we can rally voters around in order to ensure that we get the votes that we need. And this one was demonized in that way over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it's come up as such a. It's always kind of been that underlying, for lack of a better term, boogeyman, right? Like there's, they've used, and it's funny the terms that they use interchangeably that aren't actually interchangeable. Like they use affirmative action a lot, which is not interchangeable with DEI programs really, but they use it interchangeably anyway. And these are the things I guess that annoy me because it's factually inaccurate, but they do it anyway.
No, I love that you say that because it's true, right? They're connected, right? And they're in parallel. A lot of what we talk about with affirmative action does have connections to DEI, but they're not interchangeable. They're not the same thing. Affirmative action is exactly what it sounds like. It is in our attempt to level the playing field, we are going to ensure that certain people, certain groups are given opportunities, right? Because they were marginalized and they were disenfranchised. And there were specific programs historically that were put in place to ensure that they didn't receive equal opportunities. And so affirmative action is about leveling that by giving them those opportunities. When we talk about DEI, it's not giving opportunities, it is ensuring that the opportunities are not removed. It is
Right.
ensuring that that the level playing field is the policy for all people, and let the best who are the most qualified rise into those positions. And I love to go back to the inclusion part, because how could anybody be opposed to the concept, the notion, the philosophy of building an organization where the people we decided to hire feel like they belong there?
Sounds crazy, doesn't it?
Right? How could you be opposed to that? And we've talked a little bit about universities as well. If I saw that it was fit to recruit and accept someone into the university, why wouldn't I also ensure that the environment is inclusive and embracing of all people, especially the ones that I said, welcome to our university, and I gladly take your tuition money, and I gladly take your room and board money? Why would I then be opposed to ensuring that the environment isn't one in which they say, I feel like I don't belong here?
Right.
Yeah.
And they're bringing it back to the corporate world and that
Yep.
type of thing. There's another aspect of this that as we're talking about it, kind of popped in my head. But as another big part of ensuring these DEI processes and things are in place is also the legality after the fact, right? Like, you do all of these things and ensure that you're being inclusive in all of this, because there is, from a corporation standpoint, a pretty heavy legal risk if you are found to be liable, right? Like, that's
Yeah.
from taking everything else out of it, like taking all of the other, this is what you should do, like just being a good person in general, take all of that out of the equation. Like, there is still a pretty hefty legal side of it,
Yeah.
or a legal reason why you should have these policies in place. Because if it's found that you're liable for this, your company could be on the hook for a good bit of money
Yeah.
in lawsuit wise, right?
Yeah.
So, like, I don't know. It's confusing to me why you would take that chance as a company and remove
Yeah.
these policies.
That goes back to what that HR officer was telling me, that they've been looking at this stuff forever. It's it was renamed, or it took on the name DEI, but it was just simple HR policies for the longest. Now the addition of DEI is those, specifically this lens of, let's add some more things to what we're looking at as HR officers to ensure that these, going back to the unconscious biases, that those don't exist, right? So so I agree with you. There's a strong business component, a positive business component to these things, not just a moral and ethical, but from a legality, standpoint. This is just as important.
Yeah, I don't know. And I'm trying to think about all angles of this, and trying to find. I try to find both sides of an issue a lot of times, but the more I research and the more I look at this, I can't find the other issue. Like, I can't find a good positive reason to remove this stuff.
And
And
I'll
that,
one up
like,
that. I'll actually
what was
one up
that?
that. Right? When we're talking about the legal aspects of it, that's the bottom. That's the lowest hanging fruit. Let's make sure we don't get sued. But
Yeah,
there's actually a business case for DEI when you look at, and I know, so this will be a bit of a laundry list, but I share this information so that people understand that this isn't coming out of nowhere. There have been studies that show, when you talk about innovation and creativity, right, 33% more likely to have industry leading profitability when you have a diverse workforce. And these are stats. I know I run a small consulting company, but let's talk about the stats that the big boys compiled, right? That's from McKinsey. When you talk about market growth and customer satisfaction, 1.7 times more likely to be an innovation leader in their market if you have a diverse workforce. And that's from Deloitte. Employee engagement and productivity. 67% of job seekers consider workplace diversity an important factor when considering employment opportunities. That's from Glassdoor. And that one is specifically important when I think about it, because when we talk about the ever shifting landscape of new employees coming into the workplace, they are looking at companies and asking, does this company walk the talk, right? Do they
Yep.
walk the walk? Do they walk the talk of diversity? And show me how you support diversity, equity, and inclusion in your workplace. Let's look at, what you support, why you support it, what programs are there to ensure that someone who looks like me has just as much of a chance of success here as anyone else. These are things that can't be refuted, right? Reduce turnover costs. That goes without saying. When you have a sense of belonging, you stay longer. We talked about legal compliance and risk mitigation, but then just things like access to a talent pool. I came from I went to school at a predominantly white university, which was across the street from an HBCU, and they actually shared the same College of Engineering. So when you think about access to a talent pool in a company that says, well, here's a university that's a tier one research institution. Here's another university that isn't even on our recruiting radar. Yet the students who come out of the College of Engineering actually are taking the same classes from the same professors,
Mhm.
the same curriculum, because they share that same College of Engineering. Little things like that can make all the difference in the world on, are you actually accessing a diverse talent pool, and are you giving opportunities or providing opportunities for everyone to be able to be successful? Or do you label based on some antiquated, historical but antiquated idea of what makes a good future employee here, and then eliminating an entire swath of potential employees based on those antiquated policies and procedures? And then the very last one, I would say, brand reputation and loyalty. It's been shown that 64% of consumers will either buy or boycott a brand solely based on its position on social issues. Now, I had a client recently tell me, for them, um, they didn't want to share that stat because in their environment, this concept of DEI has become such a negative buzzword that they don't know where they stand in terms of how to build a loyal customer base, in if they say they support DEI, right? And that's where they are on this issue right now, which speaks volumes in and of itself. But customers, employees, potential employees, they look at where you stand on these things and determine whether this is a brand that they want to support or not.
They absolutely do. Yep.
It's I'm trying to think about how to unpack that, because you said like 15 things I want to talk about.
Yeah.
So so I'm going to start with this, because we just talked about our episode previous to this was around kind of mental health and burnout in the workplace, and we got into kind of the list of things that are the most important with Gen Z coming into the workplace.
Yeah.
And I was corrected, because my thought was number one will always be money, because that's, to me, number one is always like, how much am I making, right? That's
It was a driving factor for a long
that's
time.
just
Yeah.
how it is, right? And then number two, and my comment was, it's quickly becoming where the number two is around culture and fitting in and feeling like you belong at that company. And I was corrected on that podcast. Our guest star actually corrected me and said, well, actually, what's happening is those are flipping. Like, you're right that money was number one for a long time, but now with Gen Z coming in, what they're doing is they're actually saying it is more important. I will take a decrease in salary for this culture fit, this feeling like I belong and that I have a spot
Mhm.
here. And that really kind of opened, because as Sarah hates this term, as a geriatric millennial, as an elder millennial, right? I'm 39 years old. For me, like, my number one thing is making sure I pay the bills and all that. Like, I can
Yeah.
deal with a lot as long as I can make sure my bills are paid, right? But it seems like that attitude is shifting a little more. And we had a discussion around how this newer generation and how the workforce has changed post COVID, where the workforce has a little bit more power to kind of impose its will a little bit more in that. But it's interesting that you say that now, that this new generation coming in is valuing that more, even more than their salary. It just kind of blew my mind as we were talking about that.
Yeah, and newer generations of workers are also looking at, when you talked about culture fit, not just culture fit, but culture growth. What's the future of this organization? And if I do come in and I fit in here, um, is it always going to be this way, right? Or is there opportunity for cultural expansion, right? If I look at a company and I say maybe I don't fit into the model that they have right now, are they open to advancing that model? Are they open to having that model evolve over time? With again, going back to being purposeful about our culture and our organization, and we'll find that for the majority of us, there are parts of all of our organizations that are holdovers from the past that aren't necessarily what we need to go forward. Now, I will say this because I am smack dab in the middle of Gen X. I actually think I'm closer to the beginning of Gen X. My wife is closer to the end of Gen X, and so it's an interesting. We have some really interesting conversations. But my younger brother is he's your age. I think he just turned 40, but I am considerably older than him, right? And just the interaction that we have and the discussions that we have, where we talk about the different things that drive his fulfillment at work versus what originally drove my fulfillment versus where I am now. It's an ever shifting landscape. I think I said that earlier. And when we put this in the context of DEI, we have to be cognizant that, especially if we're running a company, if we're a C-level executive, we're high up, that we're hiring people that don't necessarily have the same perspective or outlook as we had when we started. That's not saying it's right, not saying it's wrong. It's just different. And what I caution a lot of, I do a lot of coaching with executives that say things like, "Well, I don't feel sorry for them and they need to suck it up." And I'm like, "Okay, okay." I don't think anyone was asking you to feel sorry for them. I am asking you to be an empathetic leader, which is, can I, without judgment, put myself in their shoes and understand what they're going through, what they're facing, what they're thinking, and then collectively as an organization, we can determine what the best path forward is. We can determine what we want our culture to be, and then take active steps to move in that direction. But it's not about saying your hard luck story. And just think of technology in general. If we were still using the same tools that I was using when I was coming out of grad school, right, we wouldn't even have uh, graphical user interfaces. Everything would still be a black screen with green letters on it.
Yeah, buddy.
I embrace these changes. I want these changes. They make my life so much easier and faster and more efficient.
That's
Indeed.
that's funny. And it's interesting, when I think about, bias coming from, the upper C level and things like that, my mind does not necessarily go to kind of the race issue. What my mind
Yep.
goes to a lot of time is more of the age issue, or like a monetary issue. Like, because and I'm not the young guy in the workforce anymore. I have to kind of get my mind out of that because that's not who I am anymore. But for a lot of times when I kind of moved into the corporate world in my mid 20s. Nobody cared what I was saying. Like, my opinion did not matter because a lot of the people I were working for, they were the age that I am now and had been doing it 10, 15 years. And they were just like, you just need to do what I'm telling you to do. I don't care what your opinion is, even though we were training the people that I literally just were. And I'm telling you, this is not going to work. But so that's kind of where my mind goes. You're not understanding what I'm telling you because you just assume that I don't know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Ageism in the workplace, both against older employees or against younger employees, is a big deal, and it's a type of bias,
It's a
right?
bias. That's what I was just thinking.
It's
Yeah.
it's where people will say, this older person couldn't possibly keep up. I've seen it in sales where they say, well, we have this new technology coming in and, our older workforce isn't going to be able to embrace this. Well, why wouldn't they be able to embrace it? Why would you make that assumption unless they've said, I'm not going to embrace this new technology? How do you know they're not going to embrace this new technology? And the same thing when you have younger employees coming in, age and experience may be connected, but they're two different things. I cannot assume that because of someone's age, they are experienced or inexperienced. Now, there are some things like if it takes 20 years to build a certain level of experience and this person's only been there for 20 days, maybe that's a safe assumption. But when someone is coming into a workplace and you start to label them not based on their experience, but based on their age, and make that the determining factor on what their skill level is without giving them an opportunity to prove you right or wrong, that's when it becomes dangerous. There are plenty of young people who come into the workplace who have more experience, they've worked in other places. They grew up with certain technologies. They grew up with, coding. Now I remember, when I came out of college, I didn't know how to code, but I learned on my first job how to write computer code. Well, that's something that's taught at elementary schools now. That's something that's taught on the weekends. That's some right. And so if you're using my knowledge of coding as the barometer of when someone should learn how to code, then you're off by a decade at this point. You're off by a couple of decades, right? But there's just so many of those things that when you vilify DEI, bringing it back to DEI, when you vilify DEI, there's so many of those things that get lost. Some other examples, veterans programs, right, are covered under the focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. The government has set asides for veteran-owned companies. Universities have programs that are specifically dedicated to ensuring that people who may have gone to the military right out of high school and now they've served our country and now they want to come to college, that there aren't these invisible or inherent barriers to them being able to receive that education, whether it be financial, whether it be that they're looking at these applications and this is an older student because they spent 4, 6, 10, 15 years in the military before then decide. Things like that are covered under our focus on DEI. Are we ensuring that we're removing those barriers so that everyone has an equal opportunity for success and belonging? Let alone, so on that belonging piece, when if you have someone who, using this veteran example still, right, went and served our country for 10 years and now comes to the university and, so they're enrolling as a 28-year-old on campus. Are we ensuring that they don't feel alienated and alone on campus because they're older than the traditional students? Do we have things there that are going to support their life and well-being just like any other student?
Ali, I think that's so important. I think there's a lot of people that don't even associate the things that different places have in place for veterans to make sure that they are allotted the same benefits as other people, right? And I think, like, when I think about this entire the vilifying of DEI, like, wouldn't it just be great if everybody could take a step back and like remember exactly what diversity and equity and inclusion is about, which is all of these really great topics that you're bringing up, things that I honestly I haven't thought about, because we do associate DEI has been so quite frankly associated with around race and diversity, right? That's what goes into people's mind first. Mm-hmm. So I wish that we could take a step back and really remember what it's about. What is bias? There's all different kinds of things. And I'm hoping, you talked about the pendulum swinging like over history and time, and this conversation has also, I don't know, maybe given me some hope, because Jeremy and I have been talking about this, and it is very disappointing to see DEI be vilified the way it is right now. But the point you bring up about the younger generation and what's important to them, and are they going to be choosing these colleges and universities that are getting rid of DEI because that's what's important to them?
Yeah, and it's a really tough question and situation, because at the end of the day, if someone likes a university and they've been given a scholarship to that
Right.
university, or using my own alma mater, I know that. So I just saw this stat last week. They had 76,000 applications this fall and spring for approximately like 6 to 8,000 open slots. Right. There are 70,000 additional applications that are going to go, that are going to be declined, or
Yep.
say, you didn't get in, and so what impact would it really make when you still have, close to, almost 100, three quarters of 100,000 people, right, still trying to get into this said university. And so these are not easy answers. I know people like, oh, we should do this and that will solve it all. It's not going to solve it
Not
all.
very
No,
big.
no
Yeah.
one thing is going to solve it
Right.
all. The same way as you focus on DEI in your own workplace, it's not one or two big programs, right? It's not one thing to solve these challenges. It's a number of things to show that you're embracing the concept of a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workspace.
That's that's fantastic. I think that's we're coming long on time. And I wanted to make
Yeah.
sure I give you some time here at the end of the episode. So we'll wrap it there. Ali, the rest of the time is all yours, man.
Oh, first of all, I appreciate you all inviting me to come back. As you can see, this is a topic that we can talk, and it morphs, and it
Yeah.
embraces so many things. And I think that's the reason why, when we talk about, vilifying this, or reducing it down to a simple concept, it's so difficult. And it's so difficult for us to understand how that can be done, because it isn't one thing. It's many, many things, many aspects. I look at the three of us on this podcast, and just by visual depiction of who's on my screen right now, there are 100 different biases that I know people will have. If they look at Jeremy and they see he's a bearded middle-aged man, they're going to start making assumptions about where he's from and what he knows and what he doesn't know. They look at Sarah, and we just know that from just a gender standpoint, oh, she's probably good at this but not good at that. And it's just, it blows my mind that someone could say that this isn't important, because we know that we are judged, we are stereotyped, by things that we can't change, right, all day. So again, I'm glad you all had me on. Hey, if you want to do round three sometime in the future, just ping me, and I'll be ready to continue the conversation. We can pick up right where we left off. So
All
Awesome.
right. Well, we have your information. It's
We might
definitely
take you
not
up on
out of
that.
the realm of possibility. Every time we have you on, I feel like I come up with like five more ideas of other podcast topics. So we'll leave it at that for now. And thanks everybody for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
thank you.